play a few examples, probably 5 right now, so that we don't run over time too much, of music that Sun Ra participated in before he started the orchestra. The orchestra, as we know it, dates to some point in 1955, and that was the band that started recording early in 1956. So what I'm going to do is concentrate on pre-orchestra, sometimes even pre-Sun Ra, when he was still known as Sonny Blunt. And the recorded evidence there is pretty scant, but we've been able to turn up a bit of it here and there. And I think for those of you who know Sun Ra's work from the later 50s, you'll find some interesting connections. And Kevin Whitehead, when he speaks, is going to play you some things from Sun Ra's Saturn recordings later on. Okay, first of all, the time frame. Let's see. Let's make sure I've got this right here. Sun Ra, still known then as Sonny Blunt, arrived in Chicago from Birmingham, Alabama in January 1946. He bought a one-way ticket. He decided it was time to get out of Birmingham. And he was in Chicago for a little over 15 years. He left with his band in probably the late June of 1961 to go to Montreal. Things did not work out as planned in Montreal, but they stayed there about 3 months, and then they departed to New York. And so the rest of his career would unfold away from Chicago. But these were crucial formative years for him. It was in Chicago that he changed his name. It was in Chicago that he started developing the pamphlets and broadsides that we heard a little bit of earlier this morning. It was in Chicago that he decided that, as a former leader of a territorial swing band in Alabama, he was going to write far-out music. He was going to do something that was different from what he and others had done before. Now, trying to trace Sonny's movements, particularly before he became known as Sun Ra, is not terribly easy. If you look in the records of the contracts that various members of Musicians Union Local 208 filed, the contracts that they had with various nightclubs and such, Sonny Blunt's name appears in August 1946, spelled S-O-N-N-E, which he went with for a while. In fact, here's a photo I borrowed from one of John Corbett's recent reissues. This is a photo from the late 40s, and he signs his name H. Sun Blunt, spelled the same way. But between that appearance in the contract list in August of 46 and probably January of 56, when he and the orchestra started playing at what was then called Birdland and became Budland, he never appeared while in Chicago. This is definitely true. Now, we have some idea of what he was doing at different points in there, but it does make things harder to follow in that account. The other reason that it's difficult to follow what he was doing is that he did occasionally get to record, or occasionally his arrangements appeared on a record, although he didn't actually play on it. But most of these appearances were unannounced, and we've only been able to discover them well after the fact. Sonny talked about a few of the recordings he made before he had the orchestra, but he doesn't seem to have thought that others were worth mentioning to interviewers, and we've had to rediscover them. Okay, the first affiliation I'd like to talk about is one that Sonny had for a while with a vocal harmony group called the Dozier Boys. So let me move ahead to them. I've got to show you these before we get any further. This is a pair of souvenir dice from the Club de Lisa, a place of great importance in Sun Ra lore. This is where Sonny played in the Fletcher Henderson Band in 46 and 47. This is where he had a pretty long-standing relationship with the Red Saunders Band. We'll look at some of Red Saunders a little bit later. Supposedly the most profitable aspect of the DeLisa's operations was in the basement where they conducted illegal gambling. So I think these dice are appropriate. Okay, let's first look at, I'm going to skip over Gene Wright and the Dukes of Swing because his work with them is a little better known, but if you want So here's some of Gene Wright and the Dukes of Swing during the question and answer period. I'll be happy to play that for you. The Dozier Boys were an old-fashioned harmony group. I once got rapped on the knuckles talking to a vocal group specialist when I called them a doo-wop group, because they're definitely not. They represented an older style. They started in 1946, and in one form or another, they held together until 1970. Okay, so they had quite a long career doing this kind of thing. By 1948, they were no longer allowed to compete in amateur contests because supposedly they were winning all of them. And they were getting some pretty good bookings. Where they met Sun Ra was probably in the late fall of '48 in the Beige Room. The Beige Room was the basement club in the Pershing Hotel. And in the mid-40s, this was called El Grotto. That's when Earl Hines had his band there. In the late 40s, early 50s, it was called the Beige Room. When the orchestra got started, it was called Birdland, and after the real Birdland in New York City threatened to sue them, Sonny suggested they change the name to Budland. So this is a locale that turned out to be pretty important for Sonny. So Sonny was in Gene Wright and the Dukes of Swing. He was their pianist. The Dozier Boys were appearing as the featured vocal group with the Dukes of Swing. That was a little odd because the Dozier Boys played their own instruments, but obviously during this gig that wasn't emphasized. And he got his first recording date in Chicago from that connection. The Dozier Boys were picked up by Aristocrat Records, the forerunner of Chess, and they were brought in to accompany Andrew Tibbs. I don't know how many of you have heard Andrew Tibbs, but in the late 40s, Andrew Tibbs was the #1 artist at Aristocrat. When Muddy Waters was not yet the big star that he was to become, Andrew Tibbs was their top-selling artist and the one they thought was going to do the most for them. So the Doziers were originally brought in to back Andrew Tibbs on a record date, and because none of the Dozier Boys in the late 40s played piano, the record company wanted a pianist on the date, and they suggested Sonny Blunt. Now, how do we know this? Well, I'm going to play a piece in a minute, but I don't think we would know this on account of listening to the record and saying, oh yeah, that's Sonny Blunt. It's because two of the surviving Dozier Boys have told us that that's who it was. So let me go ahead and see if I can get this. What's going on here? All right. That's Benny Cotton, the bass singer with the Dozier Boys.
Oh,